Welcome. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast on vulnerability. I'm with my podcast partner, Sue Riekels. I'm Connie Wilder, and we are delighted that you are here with us. And we're going to start with vulnerability. I'm feeling very vulnerable about the topic of vulnerability. Sue, how about you?
Same, but I'm excited to get going and talk about it.
Yeah, me too. And so I'm going to start with Brene Brown's definition of vulnerability, which involves three things: uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. When those three things are present, or one of those three things are present, we have the ability to it's the definition of vulnerability is about showing up as ourselves, showing up in those situations when there's uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And do we armor up for that? And is the armor crushing us? Or where is the armor crushing us? And so that's her definition. Sue, do you have another definition that you wanted to share this morning?
Yes. So from the dictionary, it says the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. And
Wow.
so, again, that risk that Brene talked about, I think there is a sense of risk. And maybe that's why you and I were a little vulnerable in having this discussion, because we are taking a risk about talking about our own vulnerability and exposing it a little bit more and having a conversation around it. What are your thoughts, Connie, as you hear those definitions and start to look at your own part in this vulnerability discussion?
So I'm kind of hot under the collar. And so the other piece of Brene Brown's definition is that when we cannot control the outcome. And
Mm.
so welcome to life, right? We cannot control the outcome. And how do we get quiet enough to listen to the world, to listen to the universe, to listen to God in terms of what we need in this moment to advance our goals and objectives? So vulnerability is just that. It's not weakness, it's a strength, which I know as well. I every course that I teach on vulnerability, actually I teach a lot of courses on presentation skills, and on the second class, I start that class with a quote from Daring Greatly, which is Brene Brown's first book. Well, actually, I don't know. It's not even her first book, but it's a book that put her on the platform, if you will, put her on the daily whatever. She's Brene Brown is in my daily mindset and sphere, if you will. Sue, how about you?
Well, I'm so thankful you brought up the fact that it is not a measure of weakness. It is actually a measure of courage. The other piece that I want to just come back to, and that is when we're vulnerable, we can only control this. We can't ever control what somebody's response is going to be. And I think trusting who you are vulnerable with and how much you're vulnerable is a key piece to this. Now, that doesn't mean you tell everybody your story. That means there are some people you tell that story to, or you might share that part of you with, but not everybody. And so knowing your audience is a piece to that, and that's listening here. Because if you listen here, I think there is that sense of this is helpful here to share, or this is a safe place to share, versus putting yourself out there. And I know as you work with upcoming speakers, talk about vulnerable. You're getting up in front of an audience, maybe for the first time. No matter what your content is, that's vulnerable. You don't know how they're going to respond. Every single time that audience is different. And so there are aspects to life that are vulnerable. I see it regularly. And when we do the work here and know I can only control this. So if this happens, how am I going to respond versus taking care of them? What are your thoughts on that?
You know what? That makes so much sense, and it's also the way I coach as well. In fact, we can only control what we can control. We can only control ourselves ultimately, and how I react, how I respond to certain things is in fact vulnerable in and of itself. And when one speaks of someone speaking to an audience, putting themselves out there is absolutely part of the process that we don't necessarily focus on that much. And so it's all about the content, right? All about the content, all about those slides. And it's like, no, there's a lot that goes into the slides, and the slides need to be excellent. They need to be on point, especially in today's day and age. And yet, what we do as a speaker, how we show up, matters. And is that armor crushing us, or is it inspiring us, or do we get to take off the armor and be our authentic selves? And how do we do that is one question.
Well, I was just going to ask you, when you're giving advice, how do you advise those to take off their armor or to keep a little bit on? What are your words of wisdom that you often share?
It's so interesting. It's so interesting that you're asking that question, because who am I to share any of that with anyone, right? And I have a little bit of that voice of doubt in everything I do. And so there's that piece of it. Yet my wisdom that I offer to speakers all the time is that you get to be your authentic self. It's everything you get to be, and that audience will not get this time back. So your responsibility is to be of service to that audience, and everything I coach about is to be of service to that audience, because they will not get that time back. And so that's my overriding guide, if you will. And how I coach and who I coach depends on who that person is and who shows up today. And are there commonalities in my coaching? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. And does that person differ from person A to person B? Absolutely. And so some of what I do is about harvesting the greatness that I believe is in all of us, yet it is unique. And so how do we uncover that? How do we get to the goodness that's in everyone?
Great question. Thank you, Connie. And I love that you put it back again to each person, because you're right. It's going to be different for each individual. And it is spending that time here and recognizing sometimes the question that I find myself asking is this helpful? So, as a therapist, we're taught not to share our stories at all. And yet, there are times when a portion of the story that I've lived might be actually therapeutic, but it's only for the help of the person I'm in front of, not for me, not for caring for me. And so I would share a piece. And the reason I did that is, as I sit with clients who are vulnerable, not only as a therapist, but as a coach as well, their vulnerability is what helps them heal. And I hold that space very sacredly. And there are moments where a portion of my story I feel could be therapeutic or helpful. But that's the only time that I would share in those environments.
Yeah.
And so I think it is knowing your audience. Now, sitting with you, I've shared other things that nobody else might know because you're my friend and you're my colleague. And so that felt different. And so I think for me, it's also noticing the container in which I'm talking or surrounded in, and sharing appropriately. How about yourself, Connie? When you
Well, may
think of
I
sharing?
may I follow up with a question for you, Sue?
Yeah.
And so that is, when do you make the decision about how much you're going to share with an example of you being vulnerable with a client?
Mhm. Great question. And so there's some sort of an internal knowing that I feel like I can sense. So I never make it about my story as much as you might not be aware this happened similarly to me, not ever taking the story on myself. And just sharing that much, not getting into the whole deep story. And so I think I would say a Cliff Note version is what I often have shared in those circumstances. So it's a really high level, not getting into the details and things like that. Um, Good question.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting that you are trained as a therapist, and in that training, people train you not to tell your own stories. That is largely largely what I had followed as well in my own coaching journey. And so, however, that has changed, and the ability to ascertain how much of my own story do I tell or not tell, and then getting in touch with all these inbox stuff that I get about stories and storytelling, and we've all got to tell our stories, and that's the thing is, like, I help people find their voice, trust their voice, and use their voice. And then I wasn't necessarily doing that myself. And so how do I do that more is one question I have. And I feel very, very vulnerable asking that. And I feel like I'm learning that. Some of it is sensing, some of it is trusting myself to know that my story has value. And I don't know what my next question is, Sue.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you feel like if you've healed from that story, does that impact how you share it versus if it were to be raw or open?
Wow. That's a biggie. That's a big question. Will you repeat it, please?
Yeah. So when you're thinking about sharing, do you think it would impact if you had healed from that incident or that life's experience versus it still being a little bit raw or open for you?
I think, and so I need to give some thought to that question as well. And yet, I think what I'm willing to share in a class is something that I've healed from. However, I'm saying that to a licensed therapist as well. And so I think that is the truth. Yet that vulnerability of not healing, and some of it we don't have all the answers to. I mean, a whole bunch of it we don't have all the answers to, and that's one of the things that I like about working with you on this podcast is that we don't pretend to have all the answers. And yet, I will tell you that even in my own mind, and our minds work quickly, I've thought about, oh, Connie, you need a list of the things, the 10 things we need to do as speakers, that commonality piece. And it's like, no, I don't really. And I don't think that's what we're about, right? We're about not having all the answers, and that it's okay not to have all the answers.
I love that, Connie. And I love that you are noticing primarily you've shared things that have healed, but might there be a time where you share something and you notice, hmm, my heart rate went up just a little bit when I shared that. And I think that's where it's our ongoing work to go afterwards. What do I need to recircle back with? And as leaders who run teams and manage companies, noticing when you're vulnerable and something pokes a little deeper. Can we revisit that ourselves so it doesn't impact our team? They don't have to take care of us. And we continue to evolve and grow because it's an ongoing process until we are in the ground. We're going to continue to evolve and grow, is how I at least see it. And we might not know that we haven't fully healed unless we do start to share it or
Yeah.
a part of it and we notice, there's still something a little there that I need to take note of. What are your thoughts when you share stories and think about maybe moments where you're like, that felt a little different, or I need something different around that?
Yeah, one of the things that's happened to me very recently, my 19-year-old daughter had her tonsils out on Friday, just a few days ago. Today's Monday. And so she had some complications, and she ended up going to the ER yesterday. And keep in mind that a year ago, my brother-in-law took my sister-in-law to the ER, and she died 5 days later. So that was a real I was so happy to have my daughter home for that reason, and that felt undone, yet it was happening real time yesterday. And I did reach out to a number of people proactively saying, hey, please say a prayer for my daughter. Here's why, blah, blah, blah. And that felt vulnerable, asking them for a prayer. And then the sense of keeping up and keeping them informed. Where is she? Like, everybody has a different sense of what they need and want from people. And it felt good to just be okay with what my daughter needed and to make that a priority as well, because that she is a huge, huge priority in my life.
First and foremost, Connie, thank you for sharing that with us and being vulnerable in where that took you just moments ago. I mean, Friday was just a couple of days ago. And so thank you for sharing that. And yes, those are the times when we notice. And I want to just also acknowledge you allowed yourself to be vulnerable, to reach out to people who are close to you, ask for prayer, ask for thoughts as you are going through this. And I think that is the piece that we often don't do very well. And how can we support each other in these vulnerable states? Come alongside each other, just in thought and prayer. We don't need to fix anything. We're being asked to just walk alongside. And I know I need to work on that better of like not wanting to help and just holding that space as a friend, as a colleague together. And I thank you for bringing that up because that is a huge lesson that I know I'm taking away is to ask more when we really are needing something more.
Yeah. Wow. Beautifully said, Sue. Beautifully said.
And right back at you. I appreciate you sharing that vulnerability with us. Um, I'm curious what you think about the long term effects of being vulnerable.
Mm. The long-term effects of being vulnerable, I think they're good for us. I think it's good for us to be vulnerable. It's not weakness, it is a strength. And I think those vulnerabilities make us stronger. And I think that being in touch with that vulnerable side, I'll give you another example. When we called the nurse triage line related to my daughter's surgery, and when we called 2 days later, the nurse triage line, wow, that woman, her name was Jenny. And Jenny, if you are listening to this, you were just an angel in disguise. I mean, just the way her voice landed with us, I was like, oh my gosh, she is so kind. She was so kind in that moment. And that's what we needed. My daughter had a horrible, horrible headache. And so much so that she had ice pack. She was in the basement with the lights out. Like it was terrible. And that woman, Jenny, on the Alina help desk or the nurse's desk, she was phenomenal. Just the way in which she approached us, she was so vulnerable. In fact, she asked if she could ask my daughter some questions. The way in which she presented herself was extraordinary and something so, so profound that will stay with me for a long time. And I want to answer your question as well, saying that I think the long-term effects of being vulnerable make us stronger in the long run. They enhance our relationships and they make us stronger. How about you, Sue?
Thank you, Connie, for sharing that. And I love how Jenny may never know, unless she might hear this, what an angel she was. And yet, that's where this vulnerability and holding space with each other, whether it's you're in a medical profession or some other way, just as a friend, we may never know how we impact each other. And I think that long term effect, it builds this richness that we can't get to when we're not vulnerable and holding each other, seeing each other, being real with each other, and therefore supporting each other through all of that. And I don't know about you, Connie, but I want to just start to wrap up by saying, like this richness that comes from being vulnerable, knowing when, knowing with who, knowing your surroundings, but really honing in on the richness of being vulnerable for yourself and for others, and the rewards that get rippled out into the world.
And I want to say namaste, my friend. That was beautiful. That was so beautiful. And yeah, that's that richness, knowing your audience, all of that matters, Sue. And it's beautifully said. Beautifully said. Well done, my friend.
So thank you for joining us. We invite you to go out